This afternoon, we are proud to feature the first episode of a new series, The Jews of the World. The first installment of the series is The Jews of the Sudan. The second installment will feature the Jews of India. This will take place in 2 weeks, Sunday, January 20th, so please hold that date. Today's topic is very timely because Sudan recently became part of the Abraham Accords, the peace treaty between Israel and her Muslim neighbors. We are very fortunate in having Joanna Sasson discussing the Jews of Sudan. Joanna is especially qualified in presenting today's topic. Her great-grandfather, Shlomo Malka, served as chief rabbi of Sudan for 43 years. I am also pleased to welcome Ashley Waltman, an Adat Israel member for 40 years, who will serve as our moderator. Ashley was principal of North Toronto Collegiate Institute and later served as principal of Robbins Hebrew Academy. He is a faculty advisor at the University of Toronto, OISE, and currently serves as chair of the Education Subcommittee at Adat Israel. Please welcome Ashley.
Thank you, Sherry, and a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us for today's presentation. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for this afternoon session. Joanna Sasson comes from a family of immigrants, some of who have lived in 5 different continents over the past 2 generations. Joanna grew up in New York and New Jersey before immigrating to Canada in the year 2000. She's spent her entire professional career working in the Jewish community. Most importantly, in terms of this presentation, Joanna is the great-granddaughter of Rabbi Shlomo Malka and Rabbitzin Hannah Asulin Malka. Joanna's father, Raymond Malka, was raised in the Jewish community in the Republic of the Sudan. Rabbi Malka was the longest-serving chief rabbi of the Jewish community in the Sudan, serving that community from 1906 until his death in 1949. Joanna's topic today is on that community where her great-grandfather served and her father lived, the Jews of the Sudan. After Joanna's formal presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask her questions. Please free to do so using the question and answer button. Please do not use the chat button, only the question and answer button. I will try my best to group your questions together for our guest speaker to respond. So please join me in welcoming Joanna Sasson to Adat Israel.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that most lovely introduction and warm welcome. I just want to make one quick correction. My father's name was Raymond Sasson, Zichrono Livracha. I am honored that so many of you are here today to hear a piece of Jewish history that is not well known and that, as you know, is very personal to me. I'm honored that family members and friends are on the line, and I also very much want to take a moment to thank everyone from the Adat Israel community. When my father, Raymond Sasson, Zichrono Livracha, passed away almost 7 months ago in the midst of this pandemic, this community was welcoming to those seeking a place to say Kaddish for very socially distant, mask-wearing minyanim, while simultaneously offering others the opportunity to join over a live stream, which my mom, one of my sisters, and a family friend often join. At one and the same time, while Adat Israel has opened its doors to but a few people at a time, it has also opened its doors wide. I'm going to just give me one moment now to start screen sharing. I'm really honored to be here and to have the opportunity to pay tribute to my father and to his life story in this way. It's particularly poignant for me that this very shul where I go to remember my father every morning has asked me to share his story and the story of the community that he was raised in. This slide reflects a number of people who are very much a part of this presentation. And first and foremost, it starts with my father. Today's presentation is very much steeped in the stories and memories of my father, the stories that I heard throughout my life that always began with the phrase "back home in the Sudan," a frequent refrain at mealtimes, both when it was just the family dining together and whenever my father had the opportunity to regale guests around the table. In addition, there's a handful of people who have written about the Jewish community of Sudan and or done work to preserve the life stories of the people who live there. And I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge them. My relatives, Eli Malka, David Malka, and Edmund Malka, Zichronam Livracha, and also my father's cousin, Jeff Malka, who is considered to be one of the world's leading experts on Sephardic genealogy. They have all written books about my grandfather and about my great-grandfather and about the Jewish community. There are 3 academics who have written extensively about my great-grandfather and or more broadly about the Jewish community in Sudan. My knowledge is informed particularly by Professor Nachem Ilan, who has researched and written extensively about both, as well as by works by Professors Robert Kramer and Gabriel Warburg. Finally, Daisy Aboudi is the great niece of an uncle by marriage. 6 years ago, she inaugurated a website, Tales of Jewish Sudan, dedicated to preserving the oral histories, photographs, and recipes from this community. Before I launch into my father's story, I just want to make sure that we are all geographically oriented. If you look at the map of all of Africa, note where Sudan is located, directly south of Egypt. Let me just take a quick moment to point out that Sudan was divided into the countries of Sudan and South Sudan only in 2011. The country of my father was a country that encompassed both of these regions. And to a certain point, that distinction doesn't matter because by far, nearly all of the countries Jews lived in and spent their lives in, to play off a term we use here, nearly all of them lived in the GKA, so to speak, the greater Khartoum area, Khartoum being the capital of Sudan. If you shift your attention now to the map at the bottom middle of the screen, note where Khartoum is located. Just south of where the White Nile and Blue Nile meet to become one river. I've inserted on this map the names of a few other places that I will refer to in this presentation. First of all, note where Port Sudan is on the coast of the Red Sea, about halfway along the coastline of, about halfway along Sudan's coastline along the Red Sea. And also note where Alexandria, Egypt is on the shore of the Mediterranean. Finally, I draw your attention to the map on the far right. Earlier, I jokingly referred to the greater Khartoum area. Note where Khartoum is in the lightest color section of this map, also outlined and demarcated by a red border around the city. And here you can clearly see its place between the Blue and White Nile. Across the river on the west bank is Omdurman, where the Jewish community started before migrating to Khartoum. And on the east bank of the river is North Khartoum, where the Jewish community would eventually expand to. I grew up hearing stories of bridges that spanned across the Nile and how people would walk back and forth and picnic along the banks of the Nile. Today's presentation is centered on the period during which we can speak of Jewish communal life in Sudan. It's small, both in terms of its duration and its population. The origin of the community goes back to the 1880s, maybe a little before then, though there was no rabbi yet in the community, nor any communal structures or organizations. And it comes to an end by the early 1970s, though by then there was no longer a minyan in Sudan. So we're talking at most approximately 90 years, which, given Jewish history in general, and more particularly the history of Jews in Arab lands, is really a very small slice of time. And in terms of a period of time when we can really talk about a sense of Jewish communal life, a synagogue, communal structures, communal institutions, and in particular, a community that has a rabbi serving it, we are talking about a period of 60 years from 1906 until 1965. At any one time, that is to say, at the peak of the Jewish community in the 1940s, the community numbered 1,000 people. Just to put that in perspective, there are large synagogues in Toronto, including this one, that have a membership that exceed that number. At either end of the period that I just described, I will briefly talk about other Jews who made their way to Sudan. So let's begin. What do we know about Jews being in Sudan? In a timely reference, let's start with Moses and revisit a gap in yesterday's Torah reading. Yes, in yesterday's Torah meeting, there's a gap in time where Moses leaves Egypt, and the astute reader of the portion will figure out that Moses was out of Egypt for approximately 60 years. Yes, the Torah tells us that at some point he was in Midian and met his soon-to-be father-in-law Yitro and married his daughter Tzipporah. But many of our commentators struggle with the fact that they don't think that Moses could have spent 60 years there. And among them, there are a number of midrashim, stories that come to specifically fill gaps in the narrative, that say that Moses spent his time in Cush. Now, let's discuss just for one quick moment where Cush was. A lot of people associate Cush with Ethiopia, and that's really a much later association. The Cushite Kingdom is well documented historically outside of biblical sources. And you can see here, I'm showing you the Cushite Kingdom was in an area of land known as Nubia. It probably is the most famous kingdom that occupied that land. And you can see here in the time period that we're talking about, the Cushite Kingdom encompassed the very southern part of what is Egypt, as well as a good chunk of what is Sudan. So I just want to say it tickles my fancy that at least in the rabbinic imagination, Moses walked the land that my father would walk thousands of years later. Note on this map where I have marked Elephantine, just on the border with the Cushite Kingdom. If we fast forward in time to approximately the 6th century BCE, we have a small Jewish colony living in Elephantine, which is an island in the middle of the Nile River. And we know that they were mercenaries there to prevent forces invading from the south, from Nubia. We know from papyri, and we also know, we actually have archaeological evidence of the community, that at one point, the Jews in this colony went with King Psamtik II into Nubia to prevent forces from invading. And we also have suggestion that in more peaceful times, there was trade and commerce back and forth, and the Jews in this colony were back and forth into Nubia. And then we come to the very colorful figure of David Reubini. We don't know much about him, and what we do know is very conflated with, there are a lot of very colorful legends about him, as well as some historical evidence. One of the things that has survived is his diary and travelogue, and we know that in 1522 into 1523, he spent some time in Sudan. And then from there, without having any specific names or dates, there is some sense that in the 18th century, A random Jewish trader here or there was in Sudan to do business with merchants. So far in everything that I've said, we cannot speak of Jewish communal life in Sudan. As I mentioned, the beginnings of the community can be traced only to the end of the 19th century. At that time, Sudan is under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. And in 1881, along comes the fellow that you see on the bottom left corner of your screen, Muhammad Ahmad bin Abd Allah, and he appoints himself as the Mahdi, the Redeemer. He leads a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, and Sudan comes under his rule. Just before this rebellion starts, we can document that there were at least 8 Jewish families in Umdurman. Their origins and how and why they came to be there is largely unknown. Under the rule of the Mahdi, if you weren't a Muslim, you were forced to convert. For Jewish men who are married, the way you proved your, so to speak, true faith was to take a Muslim wife. Not to have your current wife convert, but to marry someone born Muslim. I know that this sounds foreign and difficult to accept to the modern ear, for someone to have 2 wives. While among Ashkenazic Jewry, the concept of having more than one wife had been abandoned for centuries, it still happened in Middle Eastern and African culture at this time. So in a number of these families, the men did take on a second wife. As happened in other parts of the world where there was forced conversion, many members of these families professed their faith to Islam in the public domain, while in private maintaining Jewish practice. Interestingly, a number of them did this in the presence of their Muslim wives. Fortunately, the period of the Mahdi did not last very long. The British, who already are in control in other parts of Africa, decide that it is in their interest to gain control of Sudan. Lord Herbert Kitchener, an officer in the British Army, is sent to Sudan, and in the Battle of Umdurman in 1898, manages to gain control, and Sudan now comes under British rule. In a census that the British take at that time, 36 adult males declare themselves to be Jewish. I want to backtrack now, and by the way, that's a picture of Lord Herbert Kitchener on the right of your screen. I want to backtrack now a couple of years to 1896, when Kitchener first arrived in Sudan, because what he did then has implications for the future growth of the Jewish community. Upon his arrival, he determined that there was no efficient way to move military personnel and supplies in Sudan. He immediately begins construction of a railway. The first line went from Khartoum due north to the border with Egypt. And he then builds a second line that branches off north of Khartoum to the east to Port Sudan on the coastline with the Red Sea. Let me pause here for a moment and relate a couple of interesting Canadian connections to this story. I moved from New York to Toronto in 2000, and shortly after I moved here, became aware that not all that far away in Ontario is the city of Kitchener. And while this story about Lord Kitchener predates my father's birth, I grew up hearing this story all the time. It was very much a part of my father's heritage. And I wondered, was Kitchener, Ontario named for this same Lord Herbert Kitchener? And indeed it is. And I have asked numerous times over the past 20 years, why would Canada name a city for Lord Kitchener? And no one, as yet, has explained to me what Lord Kitchener did for Canada. So now, at least, you all know a little something about Lord Kitchener. Second, this detail only caught my eye when I was doing some fact-checking for this presentation. It turns out that Lord Kitchener hired one Edward Percy Gerard, a nice Canadian boy from Montreal who worked for Canada Pacific Railway, to build the railway in Sudan. Back to our story, this new railway in Sudan, while originally built for military purposes, has a positive impact on trade and commerce. The railway to Port Sudan on the Red Sea, which lets out into the Indian Ocean, opens trade routes to Asia and indeed to the world. This attracts many people to Sudan for new business opportunities, among them Jews, and the Jewish community starts to grow. Fast forward to 1906, and now we get to a much more personal part of this story, the story about my father's family. And before I go there, I sort of want to bust a little myth in that we often think of the lives of Jews in Arab lands as being very difficult, as being a struggle. And that was not the life of my father and the community he grew up in. The stories were always told in a very warm fashion. It was a lovely life. It was difficult in terms of, making a living wasn't necessarily easy, but it was a life filled with warm and nostalgic memories, both in terms of Jewish life and their relations to the community as a whole, their relations to the non-Jewish community. And now, as I said, we can start to segue into the story of Jewish communal life and get closer to my father's story. The leading family among the original 8 families from the 1880s was the Bencion Koshti family. The patriarch of the family was Moshe, and you see a picture of him on your screen. Interestingly, during the time of the Mahdi, Moshe Bencion Koshti Arabicized his name to Musa Basyuni, and he kept that name for the rest of his life, though he fully returned to Jewish practice and Jewish life. In 1906, he, along with Rabbi Eliyahu Hazan, chief rabbi of Alexandria, who had been providing some services to the small but growing Jewish community, the two of them arranged for Rabbi Shlomo Malka to come to Sudan. And from here on out, the Jewish community in Sudan would maintain very close ties with the Jewish community in Alexandria. Let me share at this point a little bit about my great-grandfather. You see a picture of him on the left of your screen. He was born in 1878 in Asafelo, a town in the Tfilalt region of Morocco. He would eventually marry Hannah Asulin, who you see on the right of your screen. She was from Tinghir, a neighboring town in the Tfilalt region. He is descended from a long line of rabbis and studies in Morocco for the rabbinate. He eventually moves to Tiberias to finish his rabbinical studies there, and his first daughter is born in Israel. From his writings, only a portion of which survive, we can discern that he was very interested in Tanakh, in the Bible and its Perushim, its commentaries, and that he was also a Kabbalist. As I mentioned, Rabbi Eliyahu Hazan knew of my great-grandfather and in 1906 requested that he come to Sudan. He came alone, and by 1908, just ahead of the formal establishment of the Jewish community, he realized that this would be a permanent gig, and he brings his wife and daughter to join him in Sudan. They would go on to have 8 more children, including my grandmother Allegra. Rabbi Malka was an all-purpose rabbi, also serving the community as the mohel, performing circumcision for boys who were born, the shochet, slaughtering animals in the proper way so that the meat would be deemed kosher, and the mashgiach, the kosher supervisor for the bakery and for large functions. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge Rabbanit Hannah Malka. I am named for her, as well as for a great-grandmother on my mother's side who also was Hannah. Rabbanit Malka very much played a prominent role in the community. She was active in community functions. The mikvah was attached to their home, and she was the primary mikvah lady. She welcomed anyone in need to their home, offering them not just a place to have meals, but also a place to stay when needed. During World War II, somehow a family fleeing Nazi Europe made their way to Sudan with but a few possessions and very little money. The family stayed with my great-grandparents and was taken care of for some time until they could get on their feet by my great-grandmother, who was by then well into her 60s. When Rabbi Malka arrives in Sudan, one of the first things he does is to meet with families who arrived before the time of the Mahdi. They indicate their desire to return to Judaism, and their Muslim wives want to convert to Judaism. After spending time with them and teaching them, Rabbi Malka is convinced of their sincerity and not only converts them, but works hard to ensure that they are accepted in the community. Remember when I referred to Moshe Bencion Koshti, now known as Musa Basyuni? His wife is one of the ones who converts to Judaism. As a sign of how accepted these families were, Musa Basyuni was appointed president of the Jewish community and would remain in that position for the rest of his life. After talking about these 8 families that remain part of the Jewish community, I want to sidetrack for a moment and go back to those first Jewish families in Sudan. I grew up believing that there were only 8 families at that time, but I have come to think that there actually very likely were more. There were some families who did not return to Judaism after the period of the Mahdi and have been lost to Judaism. And I also think that it's likely that some of the descendants of these 8 families didn't return to formal Jewish life. Today on Facebook and on Daisy's website, Tales of Jewish Sudan, you can find people who post comments to this effect. And I'm going to share one example with you from a man, as you see, by the name of Ibrahim Omer. And I've given you the website reference where I found this. This is an extract from a long article that he has posted on this website, where he talks about the period of the Mahdi. And he writes that all converts were forced to change their names to Arabic Muslim names, and many women were taken as concubines by the Mahdists. The descendants of these marriages, however, were cautious to keep their Jewish origins a secret, and their number is not a small one. Due to the peculiar social structure and the inherited perception towards the Jewish faith, the majority of these families remained with fates unknown, untraceable, and not enlisted anywhere. And then this is the fascinating part. In private, unpublished research, I made an attempt to investigate the history of Sudanese families with Jewish descent that goes back to intermarriages during the Mahdiya period. One of these happened to be my own. Of course, the mentioning of my family here is merely one example of many Sudanese families that have Jewish roots and are not listed among the 8 families founded in the Egyptian report. Here, we can see pictures of the synagogue in Sudan. In the beginnings of the Jewish community, the services were held in various locations, and it's not until 1926 that the synagogue is built. You can see 2 pictures of the interior of the synagogue, of the ark, and of the table where the Torah was read. And at the bottom, you can see a picture of the outside of the synagogue. If you look carefully, you will note that this is quite a fascinating picture. The car that you see at the very bottom of the picture gives an indication that this picture was actually not taken during the time that I'm talking about. This is a much later picture taken in the 1980s, when in fact the building had been sold and was now being used as a bank. It is, to the best of anyone's knowledge, the only picture that survives that shows the exterior of the synagogue. And people who have seen this picture have commented that, yes, in fact, that's exactly what it looked like when we were there. Sadly, eventually the building was torn down and no longer exists. These are two more pictures of the interior of the synagogue. Obviously, photos would not have been taken on Shabbat or religious holidays. So I found these two photos taken at two different weddings, and it just gives you a sense of the life inside the synagogue. The photo at the bottom right is takes place during the signing of the ketubah, and I just thought it would be lovely to show these and give a sense of life inside the synagogue. Now we're at the point in time where I can start to share more of my father's own stories. And before I do, let me just, I've traced for you the history from my grandmother's side. Let me speak for a moment to my grandfather, my father's father. My grandfather, Ibrahim Sasson, was born in Iraq. He immigrated with his family to Sudan in 1911. There's a fascinating story that in order to escape conscription in the army, two of his brothers were dressed as girls because Iraq would not allow people eligible to serve in the army to leave. So they end up in Sudan because my great-grandmother, Masuda, had a brother living in Sudan. And so my great-grandparents, Sasson Ezra and Masuda, wind up in Sudan with their 4 children. Ibrahim would marry Allegra Malka, the daughter of Rabbi Shlomo and Rabbanit Chana Malka. My father was born in 1934, the third of 7 children. What you're looking at now is a picture of Camboni College. This was a high school for men, and there was a sister school, which was either called, I've heard it referred to simply as the sister school or as Unity College, that women attended. This picture was taken well before my father's time, but it's the only picture of Camboni College that I could find, and I thought it would just at least be interesting to show you a picture of the high school that my father attended. And there's a fascinating story here. Camboni College was actually a Catholic high school, and in a fascinating story and a sign of the relationship between and among the different communities, it's almost that there was a yeshiva that operated within the high school. Early on, my great-grandfather and later his eldest son, Eli, would come to this high school, and during the portion of the day when students had Catholic studies, the Jewish students would gather for Jewish studies. And that is how my father got a Jewish education. In 1944, the B'nai B'rith Lodge opened, and when you hear the word B'nai B'rith, do not think of B'nai B'rith the way that we do in Canada in terms of its function. Please translate B'nai B'rith much more like JCC, Jewish Community Center. That's really its purpose and how it functioned in Sudan. It was a gathering place for many celebrations, and while the religious celebration would take place in the synagogue, of course, and religious services, what you see here is on the left, a picture that has been identified as a celebration taking place during Chol HaMoed Sukkot. And the lower right, obviously, many of you, sorry, hold on, sorry about that. The lower right is a celebration many of you can probably identify is happening during the holiday of Sukkot. This is a good point again. For the religious festivals, there are no pictures. And let me just talk a little bit about my father's life and some of the other holidays. Come Passover, the bakery would be thoroughly koshered in order to make matzah. They could not make matzah, enough matzah for the entire holiday. Machine-made matzah was imported from Italy, but there was a desire to at least make handmade matzah for the Seders. And my grandfather would go to the bakery, and my great-grandfather would go to the bakery to supervise the koshering process, but he was not the kind of rabbi who would stand there and just supervise. He very much rolled up his sleeves and did the hard work along with everyone else in the bakery, koshering the ovens, and then helping himself to bake the matzah. The other story I want to tell about holiday observances is in the Sephardic world, there was not the division that we see in among Ashkenazic Jewry of, Orthodox, conservative, Reform. We would probably identify the practice in the synagogue, the public practice, as, close to Orthodox Judaism, though that term does not exist at all. But everyone was welcome, and there was an understanding of, people who were more observant, less observant. There were people who drove to the synagogue on Shabbat. But there were a couple of times a year when people would not drive, on Yom Kippur and for some reason on Passover. And my father would regale us with stories of the huge sleepovers that would happen in the Jewish homes of people who lived close to the synagogue. And he would also tell us stories of sleeping on the roof, particularly, Yom Kippur time, which could be quite warm. And I would just tell a funny story, sort of in my own, like a disconnect that I have. There's actually an interesting law in the Torah, in Parshat Ki Teitzei, about how one is required to build a parapet, a fence of sorts on your roof. And I remember encountering that law numerous times over the years and thinking like, oh, that's such a ridiculous law. Why have that law? Now, in the context that I'm telling it, it's fairly obvious, but I remember like the point in time when it occurred to me, like of all people to think that, I've grown up hearing stories about how the roof was used as living quarters. Like, of course, if the roof is a living quarter, that law makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I remember that moment in time when that clicked for me, and I just thought it would be interesting to share that story now. Other things that happened at the B'nai B'rith Lodge, it was a center, as our JCCs are, of sports activity. My father was very athletic. He played basketball and tennis and soccer. In this picture, you actually see my dad. He's the fifth person in the line, the third from the back, the fifth from the front. He was part of the basketball team. This is a party that was held at the lodge, and that's actually in the front left corner of the picture. His back is towards you. That is my dad dancing with his sister Norma. I didn't really have a good place to show this slide, so I'm going to show it now. This is a picture of the Opticians Shop. You'll notice that it was run by one Maurice Goldenberg. For a long time, it was the only optician in Khartoum, and everybody, and that's where you went if you needed an optometrist. My great-grandfather actually was a man of modern times. This is, we believe, the only picture of him in Western clothing. And it indicates that, he was a man of modern times. In 1947, on the eve of the UN vote for the partition plan in what was then Palestine, my great-grandfather was an ardent Zionist, and he was moved to write a piyut, which you see on your screen. Sometime in the 1930s, after Hatikva was adopted as the anthem of the Zionist movement, he mandated that Hatikva would be the concluding hymn of every synagogue service. I believe that is the only synagogue that, to my knowledge, has ever done that. He was very progressive in how he raised his family. His daughters were the first in the Jewish community to receive a Jewish education, and he led by example. After he educated his daughters, it became common practice to do so. Esther, one of his daughters, taught piano. Another, Victorine, was a musician and an artist. And this is fascinating. His daughter, Rachel, was the first to drive a car in Khartoum. Listen to what I just said. Not the first to drive a car in the Jewish community, the first woman to drive a car in all of Khartoum. We've also uncovered a very interesting document from my great-grandfather of Tanaim. Those of you familiar with the term will think that it is conditions for a marriage. It was actually a document he wrote as conditions for a divorce, permitting the woman to remain in Sudan, permitting the woman to be independent and earn her own livelihood. I've tried to look into it. As far as I can tell, such a document does not exist anywhere else. It was his innovation to protect this woman who was getting divorced. In something that's going to sound like a bit of a joke, my great-grandfather, this is the start of it, a rabbi, an imam, and a priest, and it's not a joke. The continuation is met regularly to study our Bible together. And fortunately, we have preserved some of his writings. There's this incredible website called Chacham Hayomi, the Daily Sage, Chacham being the title of respect. I've referred to my great-grandfather as rabbi, but he was called Chacham, as many Sephardic rabbis were. And this website preserves his story and a bit of his writings. I've chosen but one to share with you. And, who knew that, I would be reading this after the week that was. But it's a quote that, resonates as much today as it did back then. My word is that I turn to religious leaders of all schools, that is to say, all faiths, to do all they can to spread peace and remove animosity and hatred, and to clear the atmosphere of religious extremism, and to learn a lesson from history and from the destruction and devastation caused by selfishness and religious fanaticism. For this is surely true, real power, and all blessing, love, and peace. We come now, and I know I'm running a little bit long. I'm going to try to wrap up quickly to the end of his life. My great-grandfather passed away in 1949, and his wife shortly thereafter. And it's worth noting here to pay attention, again, very different than what happened in other Arab lands, that while there was a little bit of tension post-1948, that was not so terrible in the life of the Jewish community in Sudan. And one way that we know this is what happened upon the death of my great-grandfather in 1949. He was accorded every respect. Religious leaders, imams, priests, ministers of all faiths attended his funeral. Camboni College and its sister school closed its doors on the day of my great-grandfather's funeral. And as the casket on the way to the cemetery would pass by Camboni College, the entire staff and faculty of both schools lined the streets that day in that area to pay their final respects to my great-grandfather. After my great-grandmother passed away, it was decided to rename the synagogue Ohel Shlomo. You see here the plaque that was hung then when the synagogue was renamed. It's significant to note that while the synagogue was renamed Ohel Shlomo, my great-grandmother's name in tribute to all that she had done for the community was also included on the plaque. This plaque now hangs in a Sephardic synagogue in Jerusalem. To fast forward a little bit to the end of the story, the Sinai campaign is in 1956 is the beginning of the end of the Jewish community in Sudan. Life got very, very difficult after that, and the Jewish community begins to disband. The aftermath of the Six-Day War truly marks the end of Jewish life, and by the early 1970s, one can no longer count a minyan in Sudan. Let me backtrack and tell the story of my father's departure, and before that, let me tell the story quickly of my father's very close friendship with a man by the name of Farouk al-Maghboul. They were very, very close friends, and one day, sometime before my father's departure, Farouk's father invites my father to breakfast. And what he tells my father in somewhat of, a coded message is he speaks to both of them that morning and makes them promise to each other that no matter what, each one would look out for the other. Fast forward to the eve of my father's departure, and my father tells Farouk that he's leaving Sudan to study. And what I can only believe as what he did to protect Farouk, that it would not be good for him to know too much more, because if you were leaving to study, you would, that would have come up in conversation before. That would be kind of a joyous thing you'd be talking about. And my father would tell us that the only way he felt safe leaving was knowing that Farouk was there to look out for the rest of the family. My father leaves with his brother in 1958. He was all of 25 years old. His brother was 19. They worked to bring the rest of the family over. And then later he would meet my mother in New York, and they would get married. They would raise a family. They would raise, if I say so myself, 3 fabulous daughters and go on to have 7 amazing grandchildren. To put the final punctuation, let me mention one more thing about the story. In 1977, a group of Malka family members bring the graves of a number of Malka family members from Khartoum to Israel, to the Givat Shaul cemetery. And their remains are interred in the Givat Shaul cemetery. And here you can see pictures of their graves as they are now in Jerusalem. And let me just put the final sort of punctuation mark on the story of Jewish life in Sudan. In the early 2000s, in another Canadian connection, Chaim Motzen, who is originally from Montreal but also lived in Toronto, he visits Sudan on unrelated business and makes his way to the Jewish cemetery in Khartoum, where he begins to document the graves and the Jewish cemetery. In September 2019, Sudan issued a proclamation welcoming all Jews to move back there. And while, to the best of my knowledge, I cannot imagine any Jew who will take Sudan up on that offer, Daisy Aboudi, just before the pandemic, exactly a year ago, makes a trip to Sudan with her brother. She's standing in the top photograph outside of the home of Musa Basuni, Moshe Bencion Koshti. And in the bottom, on the bottom of your screen are 2 photographs. One is a photograph I found, of a family on the banks of the Nile River, and you can see a bridge in the background. And when Daisy got to Sudan, she saw that very bridge looking pretty much exactly as it did then and took a picture of it. And as I mentioned early on, I grew up hearing stories of walking across the bridges and picnicking along the Nile. And it sort of gives me the same thrill to see, the picture of that bridge, exactly as it was in my father's time. So this marks the end of the presentation. I'm honored that as this talk came to fruition, Adith Israel came up with the concept of telling other little known stories and is creating a series entitled Jews Around the World. Especially as in many cases, there is no longer much, if any, Jewish life in these communities, and that those that lived in these communities and lived these experiences are getting older and passing away. These are very important stories to add to the collective narrative of the history of our people. And it's now up to us, the descendants of those who lived in these communities, to preserve our legacy. I'm honored that I've had the chance to share my story with all of you today. And with that, I know we're running a little behind schedule, so sorry that I ran a little over, but we'll segue hopefully now and have some time for a Q&A period.
Thank you, Joanna. Fascinating story of your family. I think we just have time for a couple of questions. One is, how many languages were spoken in your great-grandfather's home?
So the lingua franca was Arabic, and but that said, my father got an Camboni College was run by the British. And my father got an English language education in school. He came to the United States speaking, a remarkably good English. And talking about Arabic gives me also the opportunity to make another point about my great-grandfather. It was very important to my great-grandfather that his teachings be accessible to the masses. When I showed that quote before of my great-grandfather on the Hacham Hayomi website, it actually was translated from the Arabic into Hebrew. By far, his writings were in Arabic. He taught in Arabic. He spoke in Arabic. He gave sermons in Arabic, which was a very, very modern concept at the time. It was incredibly important to him that he teach in a way that was accessible to the people, and that meant teaching and writing in Arabic.
Great. And I think we have just time for one final question. What was the situation in Sudan during the rise of fascism in Germany and during the Holocaust?
So, to the best of my knowledge, Sudan was largely not affected by the Holocaust. I mentioned that there was a family fleeing Nazi Europe that found safety there. And I never heard any stories of any impact of the Holocaust on Sudan.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanna. Great presentation. And I turn it back to Sherry Jonas for final words.
Thank you very much. So we hope that everyone found the program not only informative, interesting, and fun. I know I did. Thank you very much. As now we can all show off and know why Kitchener was named as it was. So thank you for that. And also thank you for sharing your personal history with us. It's so meaningful when past and history joins with the present and how we can use this information to go forward. And your family's meaningful words are so relevant even today, and even at this particular moment in time. And thank you very much, Ashley, for serving as our moderator for this program. And a special thanks to the Adult Education Committee and the Adult Israel staff for putting this program together. Now I know the background to put this thing together, and it's not always that easy. So, and a recording of the presentation will be posted to the Adult Israel website in the next few days. And we look forward to seeing you at future dates when we will host Tal Becker, legal counsel for the Abraham Accords Israel Peace Treaty, Richard Kravitz, who's the President Emeritus Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, and Erwin Simon, a serial entrepreneur who founded the Hain Celestial and is the CEO of Afria, which is the world's largest marijuana company. So that sounds interesting. Thank you very much for everyone for attending. I hope that you have a great afternoon, and everyone please stay safe. And thank you, Joanna, again.
My pleasure.